Actually, land ownership is like shrouded in like a haze of mystery, unlike productive capitalists. There's a much more clarity around what's going on with them than there is about what's going on with landlords. But it seems to me that when, as you describe, industrial capitalists, for lack of a better term, start, or productive capitalists, maybe we want to say, owning more and more land, that they actually stop doing the productive stuff and they let somebody else do that and pay them the ground rent. I think that there's a slight dynamic in that direction. So, for example, the people I was talking about who made their were like media moguls and then are now the biggest landowners. Or like I mean, I wonder what will happen with Bill Gates. But also an interesting example is McDonald's that like actually came to own the land underneath their franchises all over the world, which is like, it's like in Times Square. It's like, right in the center of Tokyo. So they own this like incredibly valuable land. And actually they rent to franchises. So like family. So I don't know if you've ever been to like a fast food chain and it's like this is a family owned business, right? Because the franchise is owned by like a small group of people. And actually, McDonald's as the company is collecting ground rents from these businesses that are operating on the land that they own. So there seems to be like a kind of like movement in the direction of like actually if a productive capitalist owns enough land, they like pull back from their productive capitalist activities and just like collect the ground rent.
Okay. Hello, everyone. Welcome to another Class Unity discussion. If you like content like this, please make sure to like the video, subscribe, share with your friends, and even you can join us at classunity.org. Today, we are speaking to FTC Manning on the concept of the landowning class. Francesca writes on capitalism, housing, and ontology. They hold their PhD in economic geography from the City University of New York, and they are currently researching 20th century transfers of land titles in various Anglophone countries. And we are talking today about her paper, A Defense of the Concept of the Landowning Class as the Third Class. So thank you for joining us, Francesca. Could we start by just summarizing your paper? What is the landowning class? Why do you think that landlords should be considered a class of their own?
Sure. So I was thinking about how to say this argument in a direct way. And I was thinking the other day about what to put up back. I live on a very busy street in San Francisco, and we like had some stuff up in our front window about like free Palestine, hands off Haiti, and like people broke our window. So we had to get it fixed. And I'm like, what are we gonna put on it next? And I was thinking maybe something about class war. The idea of class war was in my mind. And so that's kind of how I was thinking about beginning our discussion of the landowning class is thinking about what do we think about when we think about class war? I believe many of you have read Marx, maybe some of you have not, but we are all kind of aware that there's this conflict, this intense contradiction and antagonism between capitalists and workers, aka proletarians, whatever you want to call it, and that we know that that conflict is actually capitalism, right? The meeting and the tension and the combination of these two classes is what capitalism is, what is unique about capitalism, which is of course why we can't only valorize workers and work as the solution, because that's one side of this problematic duo. We have to completely rethink the wage labor relation, which brings these two classes together, also every kind of aspect of it, all of the parts of our lives that have existed because of that relation have to be questioned, abolished, overcome in some way. Some aspect of this is pretty much given and I think understood by most of us. But in my sort of both political praxis and intellectual journeys, I was left unsatisfied in terms of how to use these kind of conceptual tools to deal with certain dynamics, particularly around land and housing. So, as I kind of went on that journey and I realized that Marx himself said there were not two classes, but three: the workers who own only their own labor power, the capitalists who own the means of production, and the landlords who own the land. And that piece, not only was it what Marx said, which you may or may not care, but I also have found that it is a more accurate way to understand the totality of social relations because it gives us a way of understanding things that just capitalist exploitation can't explain, such as like what are rent dynamics? Why do rent dynamics not function in the same way as sort of like commodity values? What is the sale price of land if land is not produced by labor? How are these things determined? Also, what do we think about class conflict, or if we don't want to use the word class yet, just conflict period around housing, people who are fighting for housing, around land, rural land all over the world, land grabs. How do we understand these elements? Um, it's very much there's a lot more to work with when we integrate this concept of the landowning class into the picture. So that is what I'm doing in this article. I'm saying, listen, let's actually look at the concept of the landowning class. Let's think it through. Let's see what it can do for us. And I also I do spend a lot of time in the article that we're talking about today, looking at all of the other people who've sort of tried to address the question of land. And I note that most people do not bring up this concept of the landowning class, even while they bring up the concept of ground rent. And I argue that the landowning class as a class is essential to understand ground rent because they are the ones that collect ground rent. And that relationship of ground rent extraction is only legible as something unique from profits if you understand the landowning class owning land as something special and different than owning the means of production. So I also look at how many theorists of land, many of whom I love, do not you do not consider landowners their own class, and they don't actually feel the need to say why. They just go there. They just dismiss it outright. So I kind of built up this rebuttal to this kind of implicit dismissal of the landowning class. Um, should I keep going, or do you think maybe it's time for some directed questions?
Uh, well, we can start with that definitely. So why do you think Marxists have been so thick-headed about landlords and rent? I mean, um, so I think anybody who's read volume three knows Marx distinguishes rent from aggregate profit, surplus value. It's also in the tax code and the balance sheets. And obviously, it hits us every day in obvious ways. So, yeah, why do you think Marxists have been resistant to the idea about thinking it in these, more rigorous terms that you suggest?
Well, I think that if there's two classes, the capitalists and the workers, then it's very clear that we're all on the same side, and it's the right side. Like we're all the working class and we all have the same basic interests. I don't think that's necessarily the upshot, but I think it's easier to kind of see things in that way. And I think that if there's only two classes, then we also know the strategies of class war and class struggle, which are workplace organizing, strikes, what have you. They are these canonical sites of struggle. Um, and if we question that dyad of capitalist workers, and we think of, for example, of the relationship between landowners and proletarians, even unemployed proletarians of the world, as a potential site of class struggle. That means that we completely explode what the West has taken as the canonical forms of class struggle. And I think that that's very uncomfortable for a lot of people to think that oh, maybe workplace organizing is not the fundamental site of class struggle. So I think, I mean, that's a little bit of a psychoanalytic reading or like a you know, what do I think they're thinking reading of why people do that. But I do see this like real like emotional attachment to work as the place where the most important stuff happens. Okay, maybe yes, we do support like landless peasant movements, but like that's kind of peripheral. If we take the theory of the landowning class like seriously, then we have to say that like the landless peasant struggles are as central as fundamental sites of working class proletarian anti-capitalist struggle as the Amazon workers movement that has recently had gotten a lot of really interesting analysis and coverage. So I think that that is a big reason, and in that is like racialization because in a way, it's like displacing the white industrial Western working class. Of course, there is industrial working class of every possible background and extraction and geographical location, but the theory of the working class and class struggle as we know it in the workplace is something that has been particularly cultivated by like the white Western working class, like ideological apparatus. And so there is, I think, like a feeling and a fear of white people, I speak as one, of like being displaced as like the center of history and as like the agent of history. And I think that there's something deep about that when you're like, okay, actually, maybe it's people who have completely different experience than you do, have a completely different situation than you do, waging their struggle that is like now the forefront of anti-capitalist struggle. So I think there's a lot going on there, and that makes people and people everyone myself included, you have to work so hard not to get stuck in your ways ideologically. So because if I want to say what do they say, what do they think that the reason is that the landowning, like it doesn't make any sense to me. So they'll say things like, well, just look around, like there is no landowning class. And I'm like, I do look around, like there it sure does seem to be one. There are people who have owned land, families and companies that have owned in the amount of land owned in the United States by like the same huge companies over the last 100 years is like, I don't know, something like really high, like 80%, something really high. And they're all white people too. And they're all like money that came from somewhere else first, and then they moved into owning land because land owning is like actually where I think right now the bigger money is long term. So yes, people are always saying like, oh, of course landowners don't exist in the way that they do. Of course, look how financialized land ownership is. And I'm like, give me the receipts, show me exactly why.
Right.
Like, how are you going to support that?
I think I want to get into this, section of you devote a full section of your article to, so Marxist, the Marxist, different arguments for why the landlord shouldn't be a class. But I want to go to a question real quick. Eric, do you have a question on this topic?
Yeah, kind of going off what you've been saying about, I guess, a multi-dimensional class picture is, I mean, yeah, this shouldn't displace like the fundamental conflict between workers and the, capitalist class, the ownership class. But nonetheless, you do get the possibility of conflict within the ruling class itself, the conflict between industry and landlords and I guess finance and rent seeking in general. And this is like a big part of modern politics in the 18th or rather 19th and 20th centuries is sort of this conflict between in trade policy between protectionism and expansionism and so forth. So I'm just wondering, how do we understand or can we make sense of sort of the political conflict between industry and I guess the overall rent seeking industries, landlords, but the whole like kind of financialized rent seeking apparatus that's in play now, like with, like the major asset owning companies and such. And I guess like one thing that was suggested in some of our earlier reading groups and reading Michael Hudson's work is that we're kind of going back to a situation that's maybe analogous to like the pre-revolutionary era in like the 1790s where you have labor and the industrial bourgeoisie on one side against the old feudal landlord establishment. And I'm wondering, is it possible we're going back to that? Is there like a conceivable alignment of the working class and the industrial class Because I mean, I can understand that that would be totally unacceptable to a lot of, self-described Marxists. Like, what do you mean? How on earth could we have um, that kind of solidarity when that's like the fundamental thing? But it nonetheless seems like that you would expect there to be a really firm division of interest between industry and I guess the rentier class in general. And I'm wondering how you understand that conflict.
Yeah, I mean, in your article, you also mentioned different, I don't know, theorizations for the periodization of the economy, and so some Marxists say, landlords are a thing of the past, or or they'll be done away with in the future. Yeah, what do you think about that?
Um, that was a lot of thoughts and interesting points. I did want to highlight, Eric, you said in the beginning, like, oh, we don't want to sort of displace the central contradiction between the owners and the workers. Is that what, but that there might be conflict between like capitalists and landlords. But I'm saying I do want to do that. I do want to say that we do need to include conflict between landowning interests and proletarians also in our understanding of fundamental sites of class struggle. Um, Now, also, you also mentioned the rentier class, and I do really, really reject the concept of the rentier class because what it does is it tries to take landowners who collect ground rent and lump them together with financiers. So people who collect dividends on their financial assets in various ways. People who deal in financial assets and trading and like make profits that way. People who are just or companies that are just lenders. They lend money and they get back interest. So there is a push in critical theory today to like lump all this together and call it all rent. And I'm saying no. That results in like an extreme theoretical inaccuracy that like lessens our ability to see what's going on. And actually, all of the stuff that is in that finance interest section, something else is happening there that is very important, but it is not rent. I don't think we should call it rent. I think that makes it confusing because it's not ground rent extraction. Ground rent extraction can only happen through land titles, and that is very particular. There is no thing like land, and I'm including air, water, etc. in that. And the ownership of land qua land is nothing like owning a patent or owning intellectual property rights, owning assets, bonds, etc. Those things are a very different form of ownership. And those things, an asset, a financial asset, is not like land. I can't fall asleep in a financial asset. If I sleep, I have to be in space on land. And this is also a moment where I think the theory of capitalism gets pinned down to material reality, where there is no opportunity to like say it doesn't matter what the physical reality of it is, because we actually have to be in on land all the time. Everything we do actually has to happen in space. And that spatiality is at stake in land ownership. It's the privatization of that space. It's the cordoning it off of that space. Insofar, and I think we'll get into this more, but the question of the antagonism between landowners and capitalists. And by capitalists, I mean money capitalists who do the finance and the interest bearing, whatever, and industrial capital, which like I think Marx does a better job, does a really great job of showing that these guys are like working together. They're sometimes in conflict, but they're usually working together and they are essentially pulling from the same pot. And they have the same logic. The structure of their existence is analogous, and is similar. Those guys versus the people who own land. The conflict that is possible there, I think that what I would point to is that Marx says that landlords would love, I mean, sorry, capitalists would love if the state was the landlord. And because then the state lets capitalists use land for free. And this actually does happen in a lot of places in the world. And there's this great short film where the filmmaker, and I can pull up the reference uh, flying out of my mind at the moment. He goes to, I think it's South Sudan, to this investor conference. And one of the investors is like, it's great here because they're just like the Native Americans. Like land can just be used by whoever, like they just let us use it and then leave. And it's because the state owns the land and they cut these deals with the corporations to allow them to use the land for whatever they want without really having to worry about it. So capitalists love when the state owns the land. They don't have to own the land, they don't have to pay for the land. So there is conflict sometimes around like landowners who want to put themselves in the way and get their ground rents versus the capitalists who want to use the land without rent.
First of all, I think I and everybody in the room agrees with you that, these are important distinctions we should be making. Uh, but maybe for, any the audience listening at home, um, might not be, totally familiar or understand why even, why these distinctions? Why do we have to disambiguate between, ground and rent? And actually, um, if I could ask for, I guess your explanation in your own words, the distinction between profit and rent, which I think Marxists, I mean, I hope they take it for granted. Maybe some of them don't because, if landlord is the same as a capitalist, then, you know, all profits are just profits. I mean, colloquially, I think, we treat all profits as, um, rent and profits is just, it's all profits. I think in the business community also, you know, has this sort of understanding where, whether you're making a profit as a real estate company or an industrial company, it's all just profit. So, I mean, just in your own words, why do you think it's important to make that distinction, even that one?
Right. Great question. Thank you. So, first, what is the difference between profits and rents? So, to rehearse profits for us, you have a capitalist entity. They are employing workers, living labor, and they are getting raw materials and their means of production, and they're paying for all these things. And commodities are getting produced. They might be chairs, they might be cans of soda, they might be the Adobe Office suite, whatever. And so they're then selling those commodities, or they might be, also they might be other things other people are using to create more commodities. Always good to mention that. They might be creating uh, pieces of screws that then get put into a machine that then makes, candelabras. We don't know. Whatever the capitalists are making, they then go and sell these commodities to the buyers, people like us, or really rich people, or other companies. Whoever buys those commodities, they're buying them. And then the capitalist company is making profits because they have paid their workers less than their workers are putting value into those commodities, right? That's the basic idea. Their profits are coming from the sort of work that the workers are putting in that they're not paid for. And then the money capitalists, and I think this question comes up later in the series of questions that you guys might want to ask. The money capitalists, or the interest who collects interest and other forms of financial profits, they are going to come in the picture when you think of like all these different capitalist companies making money, they're putting their money into banks. They are aggregating their social capital. They don't want their like extra $10 million just sitting around devaluing. So they're going to launch that into, and they don't say, I'm making candelabras and I can't reinvest my $10 million to make more candelabras yet. That's just not realistic. So I'm going to send that $10 million into a bank, or I am going to send it into some kind of an investment somewhere else. And so you have these other companies that are dealing with that liquid capital, and they are lending it out. They are receiving interest payments in response to that, and they're doing various other like machinations to use this extra liquidity to make more money. Of course, there's many like nuanced ways you can intervene in this money cosmos to to create sort of little pieces coming to you that are become so big you get really rich. But in any case, you're dealing with the profits of companies, you're dealing with lending money to other companies that they then use to make their own profits. And then so the interest you're getting back is from the profits from another company, right? So they're all essentially coming from the same profit system. On the other side, you have landowners who own land. Now, if they own land, first of all, it's always nice to kind of remember what is entailed when we even say landowners own land. It is the state. So you need to have some understanding of what the state is and what it's doing to even understand the existence of landowners, which I also like in terms of reintegrating a landowning class thesis, because it demands we be like, okay, well, someone is allowing them to say this land is mine, and that is offering them some kind of defense of their ownership of that land, right? So anyway, you have people who own land sanctioned by some kind of state or parastate entity. And then they're like, you need to use this land. Let's go agriculture because it's the easiest example. Here, I own all these fields. You want to make mad profits on growing corn? Great. Pay me rent and grow your corn and make your profits. So that act of saying, yes, use this land I own and pay me for the right to use it is the thing that is different than all that other kind of profit making um, cosmos that I was talking about. There is nothing similar to the ownership of a piece of the surface of the earth as there is to like moving money around, owning certain capital, etc. What is so different about it? I mean, I could like wax philosophical forever, but I think that for our purposes, what does it mean for land to be cordoned off? I'm sure some people here are familiar with things like the enclosures or primitive or originary accumulation, where like people are pushed off the land so that they then have to come work again in order to survive. So that it's like landowners, land ownership as a class and a institution that is necessary for capitalism is the embodiment of that expulsion of people from the land also. So, and that is also completely unlike that fact that like some people own, financial assets. Owning a financial asset doesn't directly mean like I can't farm here or I can't fish on this water anymore. But the ownership of land is what's actually creating this sort of fundamental material reality in which people's past forms of living are destroyed and they are compelled to engage in some way with the system of capitalism.
If I could dig into the concept of, um, rent versus ground rent, if I could just, I'd like to just give you a list of things that, maybe we would consider. A lot of people would consider them in this broader category of rent or rentiership. And
Yeah.
you could tell me which of those are rent and which of those are ground rent. So, and I'll type them into the chat as well. Um, Land,
Yeah.
uh, credit or interest, intellectual property, infrastructure, uh, brands. Did I say brands? And natural resources like oil or coal or forestry. Um, so
You put him in the chat.
yeah, yeah.
I think it's Brett Christophers who has a book where it's like one chapter on each of these things.
Really?
Yeah, or not maybe not exactly, but like I think he's called the Rentiers is something. And he talks about like each of these things and how they've created like one portion of the rentier class. And it's interesting because the part on land, he's like, well, land is like the first or like the fundamental source of rent, but then all of these things like also create rents. So so yeah, so land, of course, yes, is the basis of ground rent. Credit and interest cannot like I think calling that stuff rent is like people want to, I don't know, it's like people want to be like it's unfair. People want to use the concept of
Right.
rent being a rentier to be like it's actually like parasitic, you know? people who do stuff with weird stuff with credit and interest and get crazy rich in the world, like they aren't doing it the legit way. They're like doing it this sneaky way. And so we call them rentiers. But I'm like, I mean, capitalist, you're saying capitalists aren't sneaky and evil? Like, but straightforward, like industrial capitalists are like horribly sneaky and evil. And like, why are we trying to be like these? Like, basically, I think that there's people still like even Michael Hudson, whose work I love much of it, I think falls into this like there's the Wall Street and they're like extra bad. And like at least Main Street industrial capitalists are like straightforward and like employ us. And I'm like, no, no, no. Like we want the whole thing. The whole thing is connected. You can't make that divide. And it's all a nightmare. It's all evil. It's all causing like death, destruction, hell on earth for people everywhere, right? So I think that there's some like kind of reproduction of the vilification of the financier in that kind of move. Intellectual property as well, like, it's a financial asset and it's not material. It's like it's in financial intellectual property does like a really interesting thing with the state with law. And so I am really interested for what it's worth in like the commodity theory of law from like Pashukanis and some other people like Rob Knox, who's working a lot on the commodity theory of law and the state. That kind of gives us a better inroad to some of this stuff, but that's sort of another issue. Natural resources is probably the thing that's the most challenging to conceptualize because it almost is land. But so there is a bit of like confusion there because if you're like, for example, like mining, I think it's cobalt that's like this horribly destructive, like it happening in the Congo right now. Cobalt mining, which we need for like our batteries or our cell phones or whatever. And it's really horrible for everybody's health. Also, a colleague of mine is looking at, there's a new lithium mine that they're proposing in Vienna. They're going to like go into a hill because like they don't want them to do anything bad to the beautiful Alps. So they're going to do this crazy whatever, like going inside and taking it out on a train, blah, 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 with robots. So mining does get a little interesting because it is the land in like a more direct way, but I still think that the paradigm of agricultural production does fit it and the that like that essentially you're just going to deplete the land of the thing that you're extracting from it. So the capitalist mining company is still a productive capitalist company in the same way as an agricultural capitalist company. It's just that the resource that they are creating is depletable. And so it's like as if you could only grow rice in a certain area for 15 years and then it would no longer be viable to grow there, which is true of some agricultural products in some areas. And we're making it true of more. So ultimately, the way that natural resource extraction gets funkier is because of the way that states often relate to natural resource extraction, which is usually different than agriculture. But anyway, and then I don't know if you want to say more what you mean about infrastructure, or there was a really interesting question in the chat. I don't know if I should say it out loud or respond to it.
Can I ask a kind of direct response to on the point of like Michael Hudson's views? Because I mean, the real fundamental distinction for him is between productive and unproductive labor. I mean, he fulminates a bit, but I don't think we should emphasize too much the moralizing aspect of this. I mean, that's easy rodeo. So we're trying to distance ourselves from that as much as we can and just try to, take the analytic route.
Oh,
But in
interesting.
that respect, yeah, I mean, it still seems I'm still a little. I mean, I appreciate like the ontological singularity of the earth, like there's nothing else we can compare it to, economically speaking. But it still seems that conceptually, as a form of, as like an unproductive, as rent is an unproductive form of income. What's conceptually different from that, from say someone going into debt to purchase real estate so that its valuation can blow up and it can make a profit over like 10 or 20 years? What's the difference between that and someone who has millions of dollars and buys Picassos so that that Picasso can go from being $50 million to $100 million in 20 years? Because it seems like that's still on a really abstract level, the same circulation that's happening. Um,
Well, A person going into debt to buy land is not a member of the landowning class. Let's be no more than like I'm a member of the capitalist class when I like work for myself, like doing freelance, like editing or something, you know, for many reasons, including number one, that like if you go into debt to own land, in my opinion, and I have another piece that kind of goes more into this, you don't own the land like for the next 2 decades. Like the bank owns the land and you're
Sure.
paying ground rent to the bank in the form of a mortgage. You're paying more than the
You
value.
are, yeah, if
Yeah.
I interject, but that's also like I agree with you. This is how Hudson describes it exactly, is
Yeah.
that the cycle is that the rent income becomes the interest payment to the bank, and that the real profit is in the increase in the value of the I guess real estate asset. So are you distinguishing then between like a landlord who buys buildings, say, and ground rent? I'm still a little confused on that distinction because it seems intuitive to me. I understand what you're saying with like the financial investment that you know the rentier goes into debt, so really it's the bank who reaps the ultimate gets the ultimate payoff, I guess. But
Mhm.
yeah, I guess I'm still not sure how you're conceptualizing a landowner as distinct from like a real estate developer, and as I understand
Okay. Well, so a land you were kind of describing like someone like we might know that like buys some land because they made enough money. And then
well,
there's like,
yeah, just like a real estate developer, someone who, you know, like someone like Donald Trump back in the day who like would go into debt to like buy a build to like build a casino or something. Um,
um, I don't actually, I always like didn't read it when the things came up about how his dealings were. But um I want to make a say distinction between people who may own a couple pieces of land and people who are in the landowning class, insofar as like they don't have to borrow at all to get more land, firstly, usually. And they already own so much land that, like, yes, they want more, but like primarily their activity is collecting the ground rents on the land that they already own. And it is so astronomical, like the amounts that they're making that like we couldn't really conceive of it. So and then the real estate developer is oftentimes not owning the land that they like in the long run, not owning the land that they're working with often. Like real estate developer can refer to kind of different people doing different things. But insofar as they're talking about people who are like often like renting land and like running a building on that land or managing it or building it to then be sold. Like those aren't people who are like long-term landowners whose revenue is collected through ground rent. Does that address your question?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it seems like you're really talking about kind of what we would say is old money, you know? Like the people who've been families owning land going back to like the Magna Carta or something. Um,
Well,
but
what's it? I'm trying to remember. It's like the Tyler. The one of the biggest landowners in the United States is a family that made its empire on like media and then moved into land ownership like early 20th century and now owns like
yeah,
they're one of the biggest landowners in the
yeah,
country.
I think Bill Gates too is one of the biggest now as well.
Yeah, there you go. So
Yeah.
there is
Okay.
also something you can, it's not people who, some people, yeah, but like it's not usually those people that owned it like hundreds and hundreds of years ago are like selling pieces of it and like, doing weird stuff to try to like valorize it because they didn't like figure it out like early enough how to deal with it.
Martin, you had a question?
Yeah, I just have to throw in as a quick aside that the conversation that was just happening reminds me. I'm from England originally, and there's been a recent scandal. I don't know if how many of you heard about this. That turns out the royal family has been collecting rent from the National Health Service and the and the army and stuff for land. Like there's land where there's a warehouse where they store ambulances, and they've been paying the royal family rent because the royal family owns that land. So anyway, um, so
Yeah.
yeah,
They're getting it where they can, right? They're like, wait a
right,
second, we need
right.
another revenue stream.
Right, right. And then on a very different front, Keir Starmer's now in conversation with BlackRock. Apparently, they think he's going to sell them a lot of farmland or something. Anyway, sorry. So my question though is, so a central point that you make is that is that for capitalism to happen, for there to be capitalism, there has to be private ownership of land so that we create a class of people who have to sell their labor power to the capitalists, right? Yeah. And
And other reasons, but that's a big one. Yeah.
okay. So let's start with that. Even so granting that, I wanted to ask about the idea that capitalism requires that there be a distinct third class of people who perform that function, that is, who own the land, right? So one way of coming at this is that at one point in the paper you talk about the fact that that one and the same person can be both an industrial capitalist and a landowner, right? And then you talk about some complications that arise when we have that case, and one point you make is that they have the option of not paying themselves any rent, as it were, right? Um, so here's an imaginary situation, obviously nothing like our actual society, but imagine that the industrial capitalists own all the land, right? So um, you'd still have a class of workers who have to sell their labor power, right? Because they don't have access to land to subsist. But there wouldn't be a distinct third class of landowners. I mean, it would be the same people, as it were, who are the industrial capitalists, right? And yet it seems to me that would still be recognizable if you just build in the right other sorts of parts of the story. That would still be a recognizably capitalist economy. And so now, of course, that's nothing like the society we actually live in. Doesn't look anything like that. So my point isn't to challenge the claim that there is a landowning class, or to challenge the claim that understanding the role of a landowning class that actually exists is important in all sorts of ways. It's not to challenge the claim that conflict between workers and landowners, the landowners who actually exist, can be an important sort of class conflict and so on. This is really just about the sort of fairly theoretical claim about whether capitalism requires a distinct third class, right? And so maybe that ends up not being that important, given that it leaves these other things untouched. But still, that's so and also then that if that's right, given that the industrial capitalist who's also a landowner doesn't have to charge themselves rent, it seems like you could have capitalism without rent in that sort of, if that counts as capitalism. So is that how does that sound, or did something go
Right.
wrong there?
Beautiful question. It makes me think of like three things that I'm excited to say and see what you think.
Okay.
So number one, just technicality, like if the industrial capitalists are owning the land and they're also the landowners, they are paying ground rent to themselves. It's just not apparent. So the
Oh,
two classes are still present in that entity. It's just not easy to notice. Because yeah, so rent doesn't go away because the counterfactual will be like then all of a sudden if like other land opened up or like if whatever, the system would still exist where ground rent was being extracted or had to be in play. Um, but and then the other point I'll make before I make maybe the more interesting one is that I always try to like think when people are asking these questions about the landowning class of like what would be the same question to ask of the capitalist class, because I think people are more willing to like be like, but what about this weird situation if it happened to landowners? Whereas like you could ask the same question of capitalists. So like for example, what if all capitalists also worked at the company that they owned and received a wage? Would we say that like capitalists and working workers no longer were distinct? Like, no, of course not, right? Because the fundamental structure is still there, as is if all the industrial capitalist companies own their land, the land ownership is still there, private land ownership. Um, but the other kind of more interesting piece is that your question makes me think about is that, and this is a little bit vague because actually land ownership is like shrouded in like a haze of mystery, unlike productive capitalists. There's a much more clarity around what's going on with them than there is about what's going on with landlords. But it seems to me that when, as you describe, industrial capitalists, for lack of a better term, start, or productive capitalists, maybe we want to say, they're
mhm.
also like whatever, um, start owning more and more land, that they actually stop doing the productive stuff. And they let somebody else do that and pay them the ground rent. I think that there's a slight dynamic in that direction. So for example, the people I was talking about who made their were like media moguls and then are now the biggest landowners. Or like I mean, I wonder what will happen with Bill Gates. But also an interesting example is McDonald's that like actually came to own the land underneath their franchises all over the world, which is like, it's like in Times Square. It's like, right in the center of Tokyo. So they own this like incredibly valuable land. And actually they rent to franchises. So like family, so I don't know if you've ever been to like a fast food chain and it's like this is a family-owned business, right? Because the franchise is owned by like a small group of people. And actually, McDonald's as the company is collecting ground rents from these businesses that are operating on the land that they own. So there seems to be like a kind of like movement in the direction of like actually, if a productive capitalist owns enough land, they like pull back from their productive capitalist activities and just like collect the ground rent.
Okay, thanks a lot. That's helpful. If I can just follow up quickly with a sort of question for clarification then. So it sounds like so when you so when you're talking about there being this distinct class of landowners, the way you're using the term there, as it were, is that what it takes for there to be a distinct another class, the class of landowners, is just that there needs to be another role or another function. It doesn't have to be a different group of people performing that role.
Yeah.
Okay, so there would still be
Like the
three
capitalist
classes in the
claim.
sense that there would be three roles to play in the capitalist economy,
Well,
even though
it's
there could be
yeah,
just two groups of people doing it,
yeah,
or right.
yeah.
Okay, so
Just like the capitalist class, right? They don't have to be absolutely materially distinct from the working class in the sense of like they can still get a wage and still fulfill their role as a capitalist.
right. Okay, thanks.
This seems really interesting to me because the story I've been hearing a lot is that with the progression of capitalism and joint stock companies, you would expect the capitalist class to become more of an owner. So I think the way the story goes is big corporations, I don't know, come to own the land that they produce in, and um, they increasingly like rely less and less on big banks to finance their operations because they have their own surplus of cash. So they become their own landlord and bank financier. But what you're telling us is that actually, in the course of a capitalist's development, they pull back from production, I guess, selling their operations and just um, reinvesting their money in the land. Um, that's what you're saying, right? Is just to clarify,
I mean,
that's
I'm saying that I'm not sure, but I see
okay.
that pattern. And I have this like anecdote of like speaking to a guy at a real estate conference who used to be like a real estate mogul, like not mogul, sorry, a real estate like transaction guy for like the very, very, very wealthy landowners. And I was just like, how do I find data? Like the US doesn't keep track of the data of who owns the land, where the land transfers go. Like nobody, like I can't figure out who, I just want to know who owns the land in like Northern California. And he's like, or who's selling their land to who? And he's like, they don't want you to know. You will never know. And I was like, okay. So I think that that's happening, but I can't tell you for sure.
That's interesting.
And speaking to the comment about like, are people evil? He wasn't like, they don't want you to know because they're like evil conspiracy theorists. He's like, they have, it doesn't do them any good for you to know, so you won't know. Like it gives them nothing to like let anybody know that this is happening, so they won't. It's not like, ooh, they're like, behind closed doors, like scheming. No, it's just like they make money and they're not going to do anything that isn't, make them the money.
Right. Some corporations go public because they want to raise capital, and in order to raise capital, they have to go through the regulations of opening up their books to the public in order to collect funds. So they have a reason for going public, but landowners don't.
Which, like, if you notice, what companies, like landowning companies, are often like researched a lot. So REITs, like real estate investment trusts, get researched a lot. The companies that are public, and so you can see the data, get researched a lot. But like those are not the majority of landowning companies. Those are like a very tiny minority, actually. So we really don't know a lot.
Okay. And so if this is true that we would see this development of a productive capitalist, slowly scaling back their production or maybe selling their production and going into land ownership, I guess what sort of implications do you think that would have for an an economy in which that's happening, or um, what implications do you think that has for uh, political struggle either between uh, um, industrial capitalists and landlords, or just the state of politics as a whole? Maybe that's a very broad question, but it seems like a really interesting um, something really worth investigating.
Well, it can't just like, of course, there's got to be other capitalist companies that are willing to pay the rents. So one thing I do look at in other work that I've done is like, why do rents go up and down? And it's really a lot about like what the capitalist can pay. So the landlord will raise rents as high as capitalists can pay. So if it's very profitable to be owning land, that also means that there is like a lot that the landowners are able to take from the capitalists, a lot of profit, extra like profits that the capitalists can and will afford to pay in ground rent. So it doesn't mean like a real intense decline of the profitability of capitalist production, actually. It means, I think, a lot that there's a lot of profitability there in many situations. However, I think some things like global land rush type things are like people hedging for the future profitability of land and saying, like, I'm going to go buy like half this country that like just said that now they'll sell to foreigners because it's going to be good for me one day. And yeah. So what does it mean kind of in this moment that this is happening? I guess I only know the sort of inverse of like when was it not happening? And I don't know if you sort of as like a collective have a take on sort of the falling rate of profit theory or sort of, what happened during the post-war period that it made it so special. But I generally try to think of the post-war period not as the norm from which we're deviating, but as a special and unique moment in which you had all this destruction of capital. So like production was like really particularly profitable. So maybe during that period of time, like land own people weren't like moving into land ownership with such gusto because there were such high profit rates in production during some of those decades. It's kind of like something that seems possible, but that now we're more back on the track and as that we were on before the two world wars, which is just like a secular increase in the value of land and the prices of ground rent.
I can't say that our group has a sort of consensus on, the falling rate of profit, but I think we tend to, I mean, I can't speak for the group, but I think generally, I guess we would say that, yeah, within Marx, falling rate of profit is a sort of it's cyclical. I think, but I can say that as a group, we are very much interested in the work of Michael Hudson. Um, and so like, his story, as I understand it, is that um, capitalism can be very productive if it's industrial, and that the thing really holding it back is so the parasitism of the fire sector, finance, insurance, and real estate. And I guess he does sort of lump those together, um, and says that, as the fire sector's share of the economy gets bigger and bigger, it deducts more from the profit of industry and puts a huge barrier to growth. And if I understand you and him, it seems like your positions are different because you seem to be saying that um, rents only increase insofar as profitability increases, and that um, if you see the, I don't know, if you see the expansion of finance industry, finance, insurance, and real estate. Or yeah, I mean, I shouldn't be linking these together because you're the one that separates them in your theory. But yeah, well, at least if you see a rise of ground rent, that shouldn't really be a problem because it's only responding to higher profitability rates. So it's just growing as a share of the profit. Do I have that right?
Um, yeah. And a falling rate of profit doesn't mean the profits are falling, right? It just means that it's growing more slowly. So I think yes, and thank you for that formulation. I don't think I had like put it in that way in my mind, so I have to like put that one in my back pocket. I did want to mention that I also I have like some work under review, as they say, blah blah, about financialization, and I noted that I think it's Hudson who says real estate accounts for approximately 70% of bank lending in Britain and the United States, and some 80% of capital gains in the US economy are land price gains. So I note Hudson as a person amidst a bunch of other people who actually notice that real estate is different and like maybe plays an outsized role. When we say fire sector, it's like mostly real estate. When we look at the things, the special things that are happening to the fire sector, a large portion of them are real estate. Um, and so like, but then we need to go the extra step and be like, well, what does that mean? You know, what does that mean for us? Especially if we think that ground rent and land might be different than productive capitalist activity. I think that also I don't, it's been a little while since I like went deep into Hudson, who I really love the idea of like taking the really great like economic work he's giving us and like we can do what we want to sort of like politically with that. But I do think that he does valorize production and like work, which I'm like, nobody wants to work. You know, really, we want to do things that are meaningful and that do good things for us and the people we love and like do maybe make the world a better place. Do we want to go to work? Do we want to produce commodities? No, you know? So like that piece is I think often like missing a little bit in when we're talking about how production is better and also just how destructive wage labor is, period. Period.
Eric?
Yeah, what are the implications of climate change for land ownership? Are there any that like is that going to fuel changes in the I guess political structure of land ownership or have any impact in your opinion?
Um, I guess the way I'd ref the I think it's a question of will um the like sort of cash cow benefits of climate change for landowners outweigh the fact that some land will be like washed away. So I don't know because some people are gonna like it's gonna be a windfall, right? Because they're gonna be owning this land and like all of a sudden it's gonna be like 5 times as valuable because all this other land is no longer viable for things like living or producing grain or having cows or like having your Amazon what's it called? The server farm, right? So it's like some land is gonna rise in price dramatically, and some of it is going to get literally be washed away or otherwise become unusable. So it's just a question of like how much of one, how much of the other. I kind of tend to think that it's gonna be good for landowners because they they're going to figure out a way to like parlay the sort of scarcity of certain kinds of land and the sort of danger around living, period, to get more ground rent somehow. That's what I think. But I'm not really good at predicting the future.
Martin?
Yeah, I was just going to go back to the bit about the relationship between your work, Francesca, and Michael Hudson's, and because a couple of things struck me about that as I was reading your paper, and um, one thing that strikes me is that it was when I was reading your section on the people who think of the landowning class as withering away, and part of that reminded me of his work as I understand it, because it sounds to me like he's someone who sort of wants it to wither away, as it were. That and this is based partly on a conversation we had with him fairly recently. Um, that and this also bears on the bit about valorizing work. I think well, whether or not he valorizes work in the sense that you mean, um, my understanding, and I'm more recently on the scene with Hudson, so others might want to correct me here, but my understanding is that Hudson sort of thinks that um, it's, and I've heard him say something like the historical mission of capitalism is to sort of develop productivity to the point where socialism is possible, something like that, right? And for that to happen, productivity needs to keep increasing, and things like the fire sector get in the way of that, right? And so that's why we want capitalism. He reads Marx as thinking that sort of industrial capitalists would get rid of all that, those impediments to the sort of greater development of capitalism. So you could think, well, it's not that he thinks work is a great thing that we want in the long run, but like labor, but that in order to reach the point of productivity where socialism becomes possible, uh, industrial capitalism needs to get rid of these other things, right? And that would perhaps include pushing aside the landowning class. So yeah, does that make sense? It's a bit rambly, but
No, that absolutely makes sense. I mean, I think that the question of whether capitalism produces the possibility for global communism is like a beautiful and interesting discussion. And there's different ways to approach it. There is one way that's very sort of philosophical, where you believe that there's a sort of essence of capitalism that is like you're kind of in the beginning of what you said. It's a very sort of, Hegelian position of like it's in the essence of it to create the means of its own destruction.
mhm.
I won't go into that debate because I don't think that's what you're asking about, but or you're not even asking, you're presenting me with like an interesting piece of Hudson's argument. I think that if he's really, and I'm curious if other people think that that is what he says, because I'm like, we were there already. We've been there. We have like we can we throw away 40% of the food we produce before it even gets into people's homes. Like we have the productive forces for everyone to live like in abundance, literally. I mean, come on, globally, we have that. We've had that for a while. We have like supercomputers that live inside of this. You know what I mean? We have everything technologically we need for like probably for us to do like whatever, like 2 days of work, 2 days of something useful, and then like, have fun and like make music the rest of the time. The reason we're not doing that has nothing to do with the technological development of our world, right? The fact that people are dying of hunger or drinking dirty water has nothing to do with the fact that there's not enough food or there isn't clean water. So, yeah.
So the similarity between ground rent and other forms of rent, if I could list a couple, is that they are both an overhead cost of production. They are a deduction from profits that are produced in industry and realized in commerce,
Mhm.
and they can only deduct from profits uh, because of their monopoly position, which is guaranteed by the state. That, you know, that seems to, that seems like a very important similarity, which just kind of makes you wonder, aren't they just the same thing? Um, like, why is it so important that land um, makes them different when you have these, when they're similar in these ways?
So you're saying similar land and what
Yeah,
kind?
ground rent and other kinds of rent.
Like,
Oh, right, right, right. So, like brands or intellectual property or
okay,
interest.
sure. So yes, they appear the same way on the balance sheet in the sense of a deduction, right? And this is like Marx kind of talks about that element of it as contributing to the sort of appearance that it is just that. And he talks also about like I think that he structures volume 3 where he talks about interest and like M to M prime right before he talks about ground rent. And he talks about how much that illusion of interest, the idea that money turns into more money, just clouds the minds of everybody involved in the situation. And I think he does that to be like, and that's what we see when we see ground rent too, even though that's not what's happening. So I think and I also really like, I don't know if you guys use this copy of volume three at all. That it's the retranslation, taking the Engels editing out of it.
We use the
Yeah.
penguin.
No, I mean the Penguin's amazing, but like
Mhm.
if you're like super deep nerd and you want to be like, what was his tone? Because like Engels does a lot of like tone shifting and like rearranging, especially in these sections. And so I feel like when I read the tone in this one, it like sets you up for being like, it's really different. I think it does it in
Mhm.
the Penguin. Anyway, inside baseball, blah blah blah. It's came out in 2015 and it's just called Marx's Economic Manuscripts of 1864 to 1865. So, uh, I think there's this sort of like illusory force of M to M prime that like affects this. What I will the new piece I'll pull in right now to tell you why I think it's different is that here's what's special about land, other than the fact that we need it to live and we don't need intellectual property to live, which is important. That's not important. It's very important. I don't know if I've found the right way to philosophically describe its importance yet, but whatever. Additionally, if we're talking like in really like Marxian terms, land is monopolizable and unproduced. And I'm going to go out here and say it's the only thing that is both unproduced and monopolizable. So all the things you just described, those are produced things that you can monopolize. Land is not produced, but you can monopolize it. There's other things that are not produced you cannot monopolize, like sunlight. Not yet, maybe one day. And when it becomes monopolizable, it's going to be tied to land. It's going to be like in these areas, there's the last sunlight on Earth. And so the people who own that land are going to like be able to collect ground rent about it. So that is how I parlay the specificity of land into the kind of like productivity, unproductivity. If someone can think of something else that's monopolizable and unproduced, I want to know because I can't think of anything else.
Could I
So,
argue that money is unproduced and monopolizable is because has a it's a monopoly of the state?
like capital,
Yeah. Or yeah.
capital is
Or
produced by us.
Well, what
okay.
about credit
Credit.
as produced by like private banks?
Credit, when you say credit is produced, but it's
Yeah, it's
unproduced.
loaned.
Well,
Well,
bank
it's
loans.
unproduced and it's monopolizable.
Credit as well, you could say that it's produced because it's regulated, right? Like, so banks are allowed to create a certain amount of credit in relation to how much reserves they have. And there's like a law that like circumscribes that. So in essentially, they create it.
They create it, but it's not something that's produced in the sense of, I don't know, you think production, you think of something material, something tangible. Um,
Okay, that's true. That's true. Let's see. Maybe I need to like think about that one. So credit as being unproduced.
And I think of, well, I don't know if you mean produced by labor. That's what I think when I hear the word produced. It's sort of, yeah, credit is produced out of thin air, either out of private banks, either from private banks or the government. But even in the case of private banks, it's something that has to be sanctioned by the state.
Maybe this is what I mean. Not produced like so that not let's say not produced, but created.
Okay. Um, I want to ask you about sort of staying on the topic of Marx or what Marx
And
believed.
sorry. So like created in the sense of like people can monopolize it because they monopolize the creation of it, right?
They
but it's
can
just,
So
monopolize the career.
I guess, is this really just kind of distinguishing between things that are just parts of nature that like humanity
well,
has
no,
over
because
one?
an apple is like a product of nature, but like you
Right.
can more of it.
Yeah, yeah.
But sorry,
Okay.
so what about raw, what about, oil? I mean, so that's if I was, I
Well,
guess
oil is
maybe you were thinking that doesn't that counts as being produced because it's because we have to kind of dig it up out of the ground. before we can exchange it on the market or whatever. But
Yeah,
we wouldn't want to say it's created, would we?
it's true.
You seems like a
I
better
have
word.
to refine my formulation.
Yeah.
Sure,
I
sure.
mean, it's tricky. It does just seem tricky.
So
Yeah,
now I
but
want
you see
to,
where I'm going? Like there's something that is the nature of land that like it's not you can't create more of it. You don't need to do anything to it to like make it available except
right.
title it.
I think, yeah, I
Yeah.
think like, I mean, I agree with you on like that there's a singularity to land that makes it kind of incomparable to anything else, economically speaking. I think the thing that our group would get hung up on is just kind of like the formal ownership structure that's at play as, taking, income coming from unproductive income versus productive income. And, like we can say how evil like industrial capitalism is, which it is, I agree with you, but at least they make things, like
No,
some people
not at
don't
least
make
they make
shit.
things. What do you mean at least they make things? That's what's destroying the world and the human bodies and the environment. Like that's not good. Making things is not good.
I mean, that's the world we live in. I don't know. Like it seems
It
like
is the world we
for the
live in. But it's like,
Marx would be affirming the like industrial progress, seemingly. That's my take on Marx.
yeah,
Maybe you disagree. I
it's a
mean, I
very
agree
good.
with you. I happen to agree with you as well that like production is going to destroy the planet and all that. But I think you're right. But I mean, nonetheless, it seems like if we're trying to like refine like a vision of socialism, can you have degrowth socialism in the sense that like Marx would recognize? I don't know. Or maybe that's too kind of academic.
Well, I mean, then you're like, what do you mean about socialism, right? And I think that it's like that really is the ultimate direction that my thought goes to.
Yeah. It just seems that for Marx, socialism presupposes capitalist development as its necessary cause. That you
Yeah,
can't
I mean,
socialism
he
except for that.
it depends on
So,
like which texts you're looking at of his. And I think that these letters to Vera Zasulich has gotten a lot of play lately, where he's like, maybe actually you could just go directly from like the Russian commune to like communism, and you don't
yeah.
need to like industrialize. Um,
Well, then should
so
we? So what do you think we should be doing in terms? I mean, we're getting, I guess, pretty far away from landlords, but like, what kind of industrial policy do you think the left should be pursuing? We were actually talking to Sarah Knuth, who's a British geographer, about this and like the role of green rentiers and like the privatization of green infrastructure and that whole transition and how yeah, I mean, it's we should have like some sort of green revolution or something, but realistically, it's just going to be financialized.
well, we already did have a green revolution, right? That was the agricultural, like technological revolution of the 20th century. And
That's
that
yeah,
was like
yeah.
horrifying. And that so will, like, a lot of the green energy transition stuff are like they're mining cobalt, like in basically slave labor in the Congo, for lithium batteries and for the renewable batteries, or like they're destroying the environment in the south of Mexico by putting up wind farms. So they're like killing all of the birds and they're like changing the wind patterns. So like the trees are like getting screwed up and they're like taking people's land. So it's like, I feel like that, I mean, I'm not an expert in how to have that argument because I usually am just like, that's not the answer.
Yeah.
Um, but in terms of an industrial policy, like there should be no thing that resembles industry in communism. There should
So
be,
I mean, it sounds like someone would say that sounds like primitivism. Like, how will people live? Like, what will we live on if there's no industry?
sure. And then we ask, what do we mean by industry? Do I want like to still have like
Well, I
fast?
think we can be kind of concrete though. It's fossil
Yeah,
fuel
we
driven
can.
industry.
Oh, wait, what?
I mean, industry is driven by fossil fuels fundamentally.
I mean, some industrial
Some
product.
are. I mean, you can have them in principle based on green energy, but in practice, it's in like over 200 years. It's because of fossil fuels that
I
we've
don't
had this
actually
revolution.
I don't think that the question of do we want industry is a question of fossil fuels. I think it's a question of what scale of making things do we need and do we want to engage in? Do we still want to have mass produced stuff
Yeah.
like in big factories, which doesn't require fossil fuels? If we weren't making things with planned obsolescence, we wouldn't need to produce much at all. We would probably like if we got together in different pockets and groups and like made decisions about like what is worth making, who wants to do it, how are we going to get it done? What's the best way to like make sure it's done in a way that is good for us and our loved ones in the future? Those are the kinds of questions that like we can imagine being able to ask. And then in my mind, and then the question is, how do we get there?
Yeah.
We do have one question from one of our members that is on this along these lines, who says that most serious revolutions have involved some kind of land reform and or debt repudiation and fought landlordism, and most countries that have done so have made an enemy of the American state. So, sort of a hypothetical, if you were suddenly the executive tomorrow, never mind how you got it, just hypothetically, if like as a thought experiment, and you could use state power any way you want to, what would you do any kind of land reform? And if so, what kind of land reform would you pursue?
Well, first, I would have to do something about the military because the military, if no matter what I did or anybody did in terms of like positive land reform, it could be challenged or taken over through a military coup, which is the tradition, right? So and it is the military force of empires that stand in the way of people using land in like positive sorry to moralize. I don't really like to, but to say that like we could live on this world in a better way. What stands in the way of people living in a better way with the land and the environment and each other are like the military forces of the world, in addition to like the capitalist indoctrination of everything. So you'd have to like first like go on a project of dismembering all of the like military bases of the world and like taking apart all of the weapons and the bombs and training all of the soldiers to like do stuff that they really like to do instead of being soldiers and like treating them for all their PTSD. And then, I would say like it's time to like, well, I mean, what would I really do? I would like, step down. I would say like now the power is with Captain Planet, the power is with you all. That's what we really need. We really need people to be involved, not in electoral politics, but in like getting together and talking about what should we do? What should we do with the land? I mean, you would take away all the capitalists' land. You would take away all the capitalists. You would say, now you guys get to run it. And it would be really hard and complicated, you know? But I think the point is to get rid of the hierarchical axes of power so that people can start figuring that out. Because the point is not to move to a place where the whole world works the same, right? Or even the whole country. The point, because what happened, and this is kind of a next project, is that because I'm looking at land reforms for the last 200 years, like where they happened when, like there's kind of these different moments of like like the first like the sort of colonizing land reforms where they privatize all the land, they cordon off all the land, they get like, British mandate gets the sheikhs to like own the land that was previously like collectively owned. All of these moves to dismember anything other than private land ownership that can be alienated, right? That's essential. There was a lot of private land ownership before capitalism, but the land was not alienable. And I was reading Walter Rodney's History of the Upper Guinea Coast about all the different kinds of land relations that existed there, including private property, but you can't sell it. You can't alienate it. So the point is not to go to a place where the whole world is run on some socialist like land idea. The point is to like create the possibility for like a radical like blossoming of different ways of dealing with your land and to support each other in getting what we need globally.
Uh, we're getting towards time, so please let me know if you need to go. But I had two questions that I really wanted to ask you.
I'll stay a little over.
All right, thanks. One is about so really getting into the weeds of Volume 3 of Capital, Chapter 27. Marx makes a statement about the historical rise of joint stock holding companies and the financialization of capital ownership, which arguably changes the picture of class radically. Uh, So he says that. So I think what we've discussed so far is a couple different conceptions of class. One was the sort of naive dualistic picture, which is like the bourgeoisie versus the proletariat. Okay, then there's the other classical picture, which has the industrial, like, which is the one that you sort of are advocating for, which has the industrial capitalist, the landowner, and the working class. But in this passage, Marx says that the functions of ownership and control of capital in joint stockholding companies, of the legal entitlement to receive revenue and hands-on direction of capitalism cease to be united in the same persons. They're separated out into two distinct groups of people. The mere money capitalists, so absentee owners, which is a form of rentiership, you could say, on the one hand, and salaried managerial class on the other. And he repeatedly calls this the abolition of the capitalist mode of production and private ownership of capital in the capitalist mode of production itself. So if we take that statement seriously, then it looks like we end up with a new picture of classes that is neither the one from the classical position that you emphasize, and Marx also accepts, uh, nor the dualistic one of traditional Marxism, bourgeoisie versus proletariat. Um, And in your paper, you've shown like very clearly how traditional Marxists are wrong to treat landlords um, like they became part of the capitalist class. But what would you say about the idea that capitalists have all become like landlords, capitalized entitlements to other people's income, monopoly rent seeking, gatekeeping assets for fees, like a toll booth economy, and so on? So some people are talking about neo-feudalism. Do you think there's anything to this picture where the three classes are owners on the one hand, controllers, managers on the other, and third workers?
Sorry, I'm pulling up the quote. Can you repeat the last thing you said?
So do you think there's anything to this picture where the three classes are owners, one owners, two controller managers, and three workers?
Do I think that that's the direction of capitalism?
Um, um, yeah, do you think that class framework holds any water? Do you?
Um, okay. So I'll try to answer that, but then I feel like the big salient part in this question was about like the abolition of capitalist mode of production within the capitalist mode of production, which is like a really
Hmm.
bad thing to say. So I was like,
Sure, sure,
what
yeah,
does he mean? So I feel like
yeah,
they're kind of interesting to be like, what does he really mean here? It's like a
yeah,
discussion of socialized
sure.
capital, right? Of the what I was talking about before, like
Hmm.
the aggregation of all
Yeah,
this money, this surplus liquidity into these
yeah,
big blobs, and then like the
yeah,
management of that. That's like
yeah,
what he's talking about here.
yeah. I mean,
So
I
is that,
guess,
yeah.
sorry. Yeah, I mean, with this conception of class where you have like not industrial capitalist or a landowner, but just an owner class and the working class, but in between them is the managerial class. So is that, yeah, I guess that does sound like, yeah, like a different form of different mode of production than the classical capitalist
Yeah,
conception.
I mean, I'm always like, okay, listen, why are we like, why now is it more true that like ownership of land and ownership of other assets is like smooshed together? Like, I don't like, I hear you saying that, but I don't know why we would think that. And then
Mhm.
the fact that there's a managerial class, that also
Mhm.
doesn't, it's just that's part of capitalism, of course. I think that the
Mhm.
only way that that seems strange enough to indicate something's changed about capitalism would
Mhm.
be if you didn't acknowledge like a radically complicated hierarchy in capitalism. Like if you only see capitalists and workers, maybe the idea that there's like a managerial strata is confusing. But if you consider like the working class to include like the petit bourgeoisie and the like relative surplus army, then like you see that there is a really like almost incomprehensible like hierarchy of people in terms of their life expectancy, their like affluence, their like access to political power within people who are technically like working to some degree to survive, including the managers. So, and this is also like I think about a lot when people discuss financialization is that the managers, you could really arguably say they're producing value by managing people's money. And that financial companies, most of what they're doing is productive labor because they are doing things to the money. They are doing all of this work that changes the world for a wage, very high wage. So I don't see these pieces as troubling, like as kind of like fundamental, like structure of like capitalists, workers, landowners. And I think that that troubling as Mark, he whatever he was writing a long time ago, he acknowledged like how complicated it is. And maybe it's
Mhm.
just that like sometimes we get too stuck in volume one, so we think, it's not that
Mhm. Right, right. I mean, I do kind of wonder if Marx is, I mean, and you say that, I mean, you mentioned this earlier that Marx uses, sometimes he uses the word class kind of casually. Sometimes he seems very, um, like focused and like trying to use the word in a technical way. And so, um, on the one hand, it seems important to him that the landlords are a distinct class from industrial capitalists. Um, so, he presents that picture, the, industrial capitalist landlord and then workers. And in this picture, so I kind of wonder how seriously he's taking it. Um, uh, is this new picture um like reconcilable with the other picture or you know, where we have the owning class and the managerial class and the working class, or does he mean these, in different senses, or does he really think that like this is a meaningful break from the capitalism that he was studying in his time, that the rise of joint stockholding companies um, like fundamentally altered the class structure of the economy and society?
well, I think that we need to be careful not to think of it as a chronological development. Like
Okay.
we had this before joint stock company capitalism that we can like look at, and then we had it after. Like I think he's really tracing the basic elements and he's just building up the the parts. So I don't think he's suggesting that there was like a capitalism before, which we could return to, as I think some people want to like imply, right? But rather that like this is just if you think it's like what's is the question is always what's the metaphor? Like, okay,
Mhm.
if it's like the apple core and then it's like here's the apples like building out, this is part of the whole, and it's not like a different era of capitalism. That's my opinion.
Mhm.
So it's not something that we could think of as like extricable from capitalism itself.
Last question. Um, so in Class Unity, one text that we really like to read is a text by Mikhail Koletsky, The Political Aspects of Full Employment. So I wanted to ask you about that because there's a passage in here that I feel like I'd like to, uh, see what you think of it and how, it might relate to your work. So in this paper, Political Aspects of Full Employment, Koletsky argued that industrial capitalists will go to great lengths to avoid a full employment policy, even though it would benefit everyone but landlords and other monopoly rent seekers. Uh, Even if there were inflation upon reaching full employment, this could really only hurt landlords and other monopoly rent seekers. So, but in this instance, industrial capitalists sacrifice some of the profits they could make and give concessions to landlords and other monopoly rent seekers in order to have total control of the working class. In other words, to use unemployment, the Industrial Reserve Army, the surplus population, to control and break the working class. So Koletsky is basically arguing that there tends to be a kind of class alliance between capitalists and landlords. Do you think there is something like this going on today, where the two richer but smaller by population classes gang up on the one larger but poorer and less organized one? And are there other possibilities for class political alliances?
So I often get slightly autobiographical when I describe things in terms of my political orientation, but I'm going to go an extra leg here into autobiography to give you guys a sense of where I'm coming from. My parents are radicals. My dad was very involved in what's called the anti-work movement. Both of my parents were throughout the 80s. And my dad's tagline for my entire life, like I grew up as a kid hearing this, was full enjoyment, not full employment. Okay. So his name's Chris Carlson, and he's a cool guy. I love my dad. Shout out to you, Dad. So like the concept of like full employment is something we want has always seemed outrageous to me. Like we don't want that because of so many reasons. I almost want to just be like, duh, we don't want that. But let me say one reason. Um, Employment means that jobs that shouldn't get done are getting done. Things that are useless for society or actually negative for society and or are actually negative for the bodies and minds of the people doing them get done, get made for people to do. There are so many things that no one should be doing. Imagine if all the jobs that just shouldn't get done stopped getting done, people would have so much free time. And people, we were just figuring things out. But so I question this whole framework of full employment completely. Because also, what does that mean? Do I have to work 8 hours a week, 5 hours a day, 8 hours a day, 5 days a week? That's too much. I'm sorry. Like, come on. So like I think this is the horizon of struggle is born out of this overemphasis on the capital labor conflict and this like elevation of work and workers that we need to question and move past and push beyond. Additionally, and I was reading this article, I read it a long time ago. I was like skimming it right before our conversation. And it talks about unemployment being something that industrial capitalists don't want. And I just like that. First of all, if you guys are like interested or like friendly to like the falling rate of profit, right? Like that causes unemployment. So it's not this like collab between the landlords and the capitalists that does that. So that's a little confusing to me. Also, like I think it's chapter 25, maybe of Capital One, where like he defines proletarian as the person who has to work in order to survive and will be cast out. So unemployment is a part of the system. And industrial capitalists like make it inherently by through their activity. They create it by technological advancement and whatever. And they need it for all these reasons. So I don't know, that part of the argument is like very strange to me. Like you need people to be able to to come and work like a horrible, disgusting job because you're like, well, I don't want to be unemployed and like live this horrible other life. Yeah.
Yeah, Joan Robinson has this famous, a quip, the only, or not a quip, but a quote, the only thing worse in capitalist society, the only thing worse than being exploited by a capitalist is not being exploited by a capitalist.
Only thing
And
worse than not having a job is having a job. Yeah.
no, the only thing worse than having a job is not having a job.
But they're both true.
Yeah.
But both of what you guys said is true, right? Like it's horrible not having a job because you're cut out of society. But it's also horrible having a job. And like I try to not have a job as much as I can afford to not have a job, So that doesn't mean I don't do what I think are like good stuff with my time, you know? So
Well, thank you so much for coming to talk to us. I really enjoyed this conversation. Um, yeah, and I hope we keep in touch and maybe do it again sometime.
yes, thank you so much for inviting me. It's a total treat to get to chat with you guys and be here with you.
Arise, ye workers, from your slumber. Arise, ye prisoners of want. That's right. For reason in revolt now thunder. Chains of hatred, greed, and fear. Ha ha! Away with all your superstitions. Serve our masses, arise, arise. We'll change henceforth the old tradition and spurn the dust to win the prize. So comrades, come on and rally. Then the last fight, let us face. The International unites the whole darn human race. So comrades, come on, let's go rally. And the last fight, let us face. The International unites the whole darn human race. No more deluded by reaction. On tyrants only we'll make war. The soldiers too will take strike action. They'll break ranks and fight no more. And if those cannibals keep trying to sacrifice us to their pride, each at the forge must do their duty, and we'll strike while the iron is hot. So comrades, come on, let's go rally. And the last fight, let us face. The International unites the whole beautiful human race. So comrades, come on, let's go rally. Ha! And the last fight, let us face.